The rookie in the freight yard couldn't back a trailer to save his life. At least, that's what everyone thought. They shoved him onto the worst shifts, gave him the oldest rigs, and laughed behind his back. But when a high-value load vanished, this so-called rookie made one phone call, and the entire yard froze. What they didn't know, he was their CEO in disguise. The first blast of the air horn was sharp enough to rattle the mirrors. The second one was longer, angrier, accompanied by the throaty rev of a diesel engine. Connor Stanford's hands tightened around the worn steering wheel as he tried to ease the 18-wheeler into reverse. The clutch groaned. The trailer didn't budge. "Move it, rookie!" someone shouted from behind, their voice cutting through the February chill. Connor's heart thudded in his chest. The truck had stalled right across the main lane of the Stanford Freight and Logistics Yard, blocking 2 incoming rigs and a forklift hauling a stack of pallets. His palms were slick with sweat, and the faint smell of diesel mixed with the icy air creeping in through the cracked window. He glanced in the side mirror. A line of trucks stretched all the way to the gate, drivers glaring at him like he'd just ruined their day. Another horn blared, followed by a sarcastic, "Need me to call your mommy, driver?" Connor bit the inside of his cheek, reached down, and coaxed the shifter into gear. The engine sputtered, lurched, then finally obeyed. He inched the rig back into the narrow lane, feeling every pair of eyes on him. A forklift operator rolled past and shook his head. Somewhere near the dispatch office, he could hear muffled laughter. He parked near the far edge of the lot, away from the others, and took a deep breath. It had been years since he'd actually handled a rig. Not since before Stanford Freight had grown into one of the largest regional carriers in the Midwest. He could still remember the long days behind the wheel when he was a young man, hauling freight up and down I-80. But these days, his office was on the top floor of the corporate building, miles away from the mud and the rumble of engines. Going undercover had been his idea. Reports had crossed his desk for months. Late deliveries, damaged freight, rising turnover, anonymous complaints about management being out of touch. Sitting in meetings, hearing the same excuses from department heads, Connor realized he didn't trust the filtered information anymore. He needed to see the truth for himself. So, with only the chairman and his assistant in on the plan, he signed himself into the company's new hire program under the name Connor Daniels, a supposed rookie with just enough driving history to get a seat behind the wheel. The welcome wasn't warm. At orientation, the dispatcher barely looked up from her computer. "Yard work first. We'll get you a truck when one's free." By yard work, she meant hauling trash bins, sweeping loading docks, and fetching coffee for drivers who smirked at him from the break room couch. When he finally got a truck assignment, the yard mechanic, a lanky man named Pete with a toothpick hanging from his mouth, handed him keys to a rig that looked like it had survived 3 winters too many. "Brakes are a little soft, but she'll roll," Pete said, already walking away. The break room wasn't any better. Connor stood by the coffee machine, pouring a lukewarm cup, when a group of drivers crowded around the table, swapping road stories and ignoring his presence. One man slid into the seat Connor had been eyeing without a word. The conversation rolled on without him. It didn't take long to notice 2 faces that didn't match the usual rhythm of the yard. Matt Lawson, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and 40 years of highway etched into his lines, kept mostly to himself. He spoke slowly, with a dry wit, but didn't waste words on newcomers. Then there was Tina Arnold, mid-30s, sharp-eyed, with her hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun under a faded ball cap. She ran her routes with precision, never lingering to gossip, and was always back in the yard before anyone realized she'd left. Connor's first week was a gauntlet. Dispatchers gave him back-to-back night runs, sending him to remote drop points with incomplete directions. Twice, he was given trailers with half-broken light assemblies and told to deal with it. More than once, his deliveries were late. They gave him schedules that made no sense, a deliberate way to test or humiliate him, he suspected. Still, he kept his head down. He fixed minor problems in his truck before they got worse, noting each one in the mental ledger he'd been keeping since day one. He ate alone most nights, using the quiet to watch and listen. The yard had its own unspoken hierarchy, the old guard of veteran drivers who got the best routes, the younger speed haulers chasing bonuses, and the unlucky few stuck in the middle, bearing the brunt of the extra shifts. There was resentment in the air, thick enough to taste. One evening, as he sat in the cab finishing paperwork, Matt walked past and tapped the side of Connor's truck. "You're blocking the fuel lane," he said, not unkindly. Connor shifted out of the way, and Matt gave a faint nod. It wasn't friendship, but it wasn't disdain either. By the end of the week, Connor's back ached from chaining up tires in the cold, and his knuckles were scraped raw from swapping a brake light assembly in the dark. But he was learning not just about the yard's daily grind, but about its fractures. Shipments left without proper inspections. Fuel logs with odd gaps. A yard supervisor who seemed too cozy with certain drivers, waving them through without checks. He didn't confront anyone. For now, the rookie role suited him fine. The more invisible he was, the more he could see. Still, that first day's chorus of blaring horns stayed with him. They'd seen a clumsy newcomer and assumed he had nothing to offer. And maybe, for the moment, that was exactly what he wanted them to think. Because Connor Stanford wasn't here to impress them, he was here to find the cracks no one in the boardroom could see. And something told him those cracks ran deeper than a stalled truck in the middle of a freight yard. Connor's second week began before dawn, the yard still half asleep under a low, icy fog. His assignment was taped to the dispatch window in thick marker. Run 442, Cleveland to Gary. Night Hall. No explanation. Just another long stretch of asphalt with little chance to talk to anyone. By now, he knew it wasn't random. The worst runs, the ones that kept you away from home, forced you into cramped truck stop motels, or dropped you back into the yard just as the coffee went cold, were given to drivers who hadn't earned better treatment. And rookies, by definition, stayed at the bottom of that list. Connor rolled through the gate with his assigned trailer, noting how the frost clung to the aluminum siding. The brakes squealed when he slowed at the exit. On the highway, the hum of the tires was a steady companion, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The deeper into the charade he went, the more he saw the layers of discontent. At a fuel stop outside Toledo, he overheard two younger drivers griping about load pay cuts and mysterious delays in reimbursements. "They're holding on to our money, man," one said, flicking his cigarette. "Can't even get the company card to work half the time." Later that night, he found Tina in the yard's dimly lit maintenance bay, checking the latch on her trailer. She barely glanced up as he approached. "You run hard," he said. She tightened the latch and finally looked at him. "I have to. Dispatch screws up my route. I miss my daughter's school play. Again. And it's always, sorry, Tina, last-minute change." Funny how it's never last minute for the guys who golf with the supervisor. Her tone wasn't bitter so much as tired, the voice of someone who'd stopped expecting things to change. Connor didn't press her, but he filed the information away. Favoritism was a cancer in any operation, and here it seemed chronic. Matt's warning came a few days later. Connor was checking his trailer's marker lights when the older driver wandered over, hands stuffed in the pockets of his oil-stained jacket. "You like working nights?" Matt asked. "Don't mind it," Connor replied. Matt gave him a long, assessing look. "Watch what you say. Years back, I sent in reports, brake issues, weight violations, you name it. Next thing I knew, my routes got longer, my loads heavier, and the paychecks smaller. That's how they shut you up here." It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. Connor could see it in the man's eyes, the cautious way he measured each word, like someone who'd learned the cost of honesty. Patterns began to emerge. The same group of 4 drivers always seemed to pull in with lower fuel readings than anyone else, even on identical routes. Yet their logs were pristine, perfectly balanced. Connor knew from experience that fuel data could be manipulated, but it took coordination, and usually someone on the inside. That inside seemed to be Dean Campbell, the yard supervisor. Dean was a man in his late 40s with a permanent smirk and an untucked reflective vest. He spent as much time chatting with a handful of favored drivers as he did actually managing the yard. Connor noticed how he'd wave certain subcontractor trucks past inspection entirely, while others had to go through the full checklist. One rainy afternoon, Connor watched from his cab as Dean leaned against a forklift, laughing with a subcontractor driver in a brand new Peterbilt. A clipboard passed between them. A handshake followed, quick but deliberate. Minutes later, the subcontractor's trailer was backed into Bay 3, where it stayed far longer than standard unloading required. Connor wasn't the only one paying attention. The next night, Tina climbed into her cab just as he was finishing his pre-trip check. She lowered her voice. "You ever notice how dispatch changes times for certain runs? Always for the same guys, and it never shows up in the official schedule." That confirmed what Connor had already suspected. There was a network operating here, quietly bending the rules for its own benefit. The challenge was proving it. The turning point came 2 weeks in when a priority load vanished. It was a shipment of automotive parts bound for a major client, the kind of delivery that came with penalties if delayed. By morning, the yard was buzzing with rumors. Wrong route, GPS malfunction, driver error. Officially, the report blamed route confusion caused by outdated navigation files. But Connor had been in the yard long enough to recognize a cover story. That load hadn't just gone missing. It had been redirected. Matt found him later that day, leaning against the back of his truck with a paper cup of coffee. "You hear about the Cleveland load? That's the 3rd time this quarter something's gone missing. And you can bet it's always high-value freight." Connor didn't answer, but inside, the plan was already forming. The rookie act had gotten him this far, kept eyes off his true intentions. Now it was time to start pulling on the threads and see how many of them led back to Dean Campbell. Connor didn't waste time after the Cleveland load went missing. The official explanation, outdated navigation files, was the kind of boilerplate excuse a corporate email could spit out in 30 seconds. But Connor had seen enough patterns to know this wasn't an isolated slip-up. It was a piece of something bigger. That night, under the dull yellow lights of the maintenance bay, he found his way into the small, glass-walled dispatch office while most of the yard was out on runs. A corkboard behind the desk held printouts of route schedules, driver assignments, and fuel logs. His eyes landed on 2 runs from the previous month that had been reassigned at the last minute. Both high-value loads, both given to drivers in Dean Campbell's circle. Connor didn't take anything. Years of boardroom strategy had trained him to memorize details quickly. The destinations, departure times, and fuel allotments burned into his memory like neon. The next morning, he started quietly asking questions. Not direct ones, just casual talk over coffee in the break room. "Ever get sent off route for a pickup?" he'd ask. Most drivers shrugged. But one, a thin, restless man named Cody with a faded bandana around his neck, hesitated before answering. "Once or twice," Cody said. "Dean says it's a favor job, pays in cash. You don't ask questions, you just drive." Connor didn't push, spook the wrong person, and the whole thing could fold in on itself. Instead, he began mapping out the truck movements in his notebook after each shift. Certain trailers disappeared from the yard for hours without official logs to match. The fuel readings from those trips were off too, just enough to be suspicious, not enough to trigger an audit. One afternoon, while fueling up at a truck stop outside Fort Wayne, Connor spotted one of Dean's favored drivers, a heavy-set man named Willis, topping off his tanks. Nothing unusual except for the fact that Willis's official route should have put him in Illinois. Connor casually checked his own watch and did the math. Willis was over 200 miles off course. That night, Connor parked his rig in a shadowed corner of the yard and waited. Close to midnight, a subcontractor trailer, unmarked white box, no company logos, rolled in through the side gate. Dean himself stepped out of his office to wave it toward Bay 3. No inspection, no paperwork. Connor's suspicion sharpened into certainty. This wasn't sloppy management, it was deliberate. Freight was being offloaded from company trucks into subcontractor trailers, probably sold on the side. The missing Cleveland load fit the pattern perfectly. The next piece came from Matt. Connor found him in the yard, tightening a tarp over a flatbed. The older driver glanced around before speaking. "I've seen that white trailer before. Back in 17, I filed a report about loads being shifted after hours. Same guy running the forklift. Same supervisor looking the other way. Corporate never called me back." Matt handed him a folded piece of paper. It was a photocopy of his original report, complete with timestamps and the list of shipments he'd flagged. Connor's stomach tightened. One of the shipments was automotive parts, bound for the same client the Cleveland load had been destined for. The theft ring had been operating for years. Connor needed more than hearsay if he wanted to bring this down without tipping his hand too soon. That's when Tina stepped in. She caught him in the break room late one evening, sliding into the chair across from him. "I overheard dispatch again," she said quietly. "They changed the delivery window on one of Dean's guys, but the load sheet still shows the original time. They're running shadow schedules, Connor. 2 sets of records." Connor leaned forward. "Can you get me a copy?" She hesitated. "If they catch me—" "They won't," he said, keeping his tone steady. "And if they do, you won't be standing alone." The next night, Tina handed him a folded manifest, pulled from Dispatch's side desk. Side by side with the official schedule, it was damning. Different times, different drop points, same trailer numbers. With this, Connor could see the full web Dean's circle of drivers, the altered schedules, the off-route fuel stops, the unmarked subcontractor pickups. The Cleveland shipment hadn't just vanished. It had been redirected through the same system, probably broken down and sold before the official confusion story even reached the client. Still, he couldn't just walk into corporate and blow the whistle. Not as Connor Daniels. Not yet. If he wanted the takedown to stick, he needed to make the revelation in a way that couldn't be buried or spun. That meant waiting for the perfect moment, when the whole yard would be watching. He didn't have to wait long. Word spread that the replacement load for the Cleveland client was coming in late Friday afternoon, during peak shift change, every driver, dispatcher, and yard worker in one place. Dean would be there, clipboard in hand, enjoying the rush hour chaos. Connor made his choice. Friday would be the day. He'd confront Dean, pull the thread until it unraveled in front of everyone, and then drop the truth so hard it couldn't be ignored. For now, he slipped the incriminating papers into the lining of his work jacket and went back to work, the faint roar of diesel engines covering the sound of the trap quietly setting itself. Friday afternoon hit the freight yard like a storm. Diesel fumes hung thick in the air, engines idling in every lane as rigs jostled for position. Forklifts darted between trailers, drivers shouted over the noise, and the metallic slam of trailer doors echoed off the corrugated walls. This was peak shift change, a chaotic dance the yard performed twice a day, every day. Connor had chosen this moment for a reason. He wanted eyes, he wanted witnesses, and he wanted Dean Campbell with nowhere to retreat. Dean stood near the main loading bay, clipboard in one hand, coffee in the other, wearing the same smug half-smile he always did when traffic in the yard bent to his authority. Connor stepped down from his cab, the folded documents tucked into his back pocket. His boots crunched on the gravel as he walked toward him. "Dean," Connor called out, his voice cutting through the noise. The supervisor glanced up, irritation flickering across his face. "Make it quick, rookie. We've got trucks stacked to the gate." Connor stopped a few feet away. "About that Cleveland load. I know where it went." Dean's smile thinned. "You're still hung up on that? GPS screwed it up. End of story. Not according to these." Connor pulled the manifests and schedule sheets from his pocket and handed them over. 2 sets of delivery times, 2 different destinations, same trailers, and they matched the fuel logs and gate records from the night it disappeared. Dean flipped through the pages, barely glancing at them before shoving them back. "You've been snooping. That's dangerous. You don't know how things work around here." "Oh, I know exactly how things work," Connor said, his tone calm but carrying enough weight to make a few nearby drivers glance over. "You alter schedules, reroute loads, siphon fuel, and sell off freight through subcontractors. And you've been doing it for years." The chatter around them began to fade as more people noticed the confrontation. Forklift drivers slowed, engines idled, conversations died. Dean stepped forward, lowering his voice but not his smirk. "You think anyone's going to believe you? You're a nobody, just another greenhorn who can't keep his head down." That was Connor's cue. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and scrolled to a saved contact. Then maybe they'll believe this call. He hit the speaker button. The phone rang twice before a deep, steady voice answered. "This is Charles Whitaker." "Charlie, it's Connor Stanford," he said, loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear. "I'm standing in the yard with proof of ongoing theft, route manipulation, and fuel fraud involving one of our supervisors." There was a beat of stunned silence, in the yard and on the line. Dean's smirk vanished, replaced by a pale, frozen stare. "Connor, Stanford." Matt's voice came from somewhere in the growing crowd. "That's right," Connor said, turning so everyone could hear. "I've been here for weeks, working the same shifts, driving the same battered rigs you have. I've seen the broken systems, the favoritism, and the outright theft. And it stops today." On the other end of the line, Whitaker's tone sharpened. "Stay where you are. Security and audit are inbound." Dean tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the moment. Two corporate security officers in navy windbreakers emerged from the side gate, flanking a stern-faced auditor. The crowd stepped back as they walked straight to Dean. "Dean Campbell," one of them said, "you'll need to come with us." Within minutes, Dean was escorted off the yard, his clipboard left lying in the gravel. The silence that followed wasn't triumphant, just heavy. The weight of years of suspicion finally confirmed. Connor looked over the faces watching him. Drivers, mechanics, forklift operators. Some wary, some relieved. "I know this place hasn't felt fair for a long time," he said. "That changes now. Starting today, there's a direct line from this yard to my office. You've got concerns? You'll be heard." It would have been easy to stop there, to let the guilty face the consequences and move on. But Connor had seen enough in these weeks to know not everyone caught in Dean's web had been there by choice. The next Monday, a memo went out. Drivers with minor involvement would have the chance to keep their jobs under a retraining and ethics program. Matt Lawson was promoted to oversee yard operations and mechanic inspections. Tina Arnold was offered leadership of a new rapid response fleet division, built to handle high-priority runs without the chaos of last-minute changes. In the weeks that followed, the yard looked different. Trucks were inspected properly, routes made sense, and the break room chatter shifted from bitterness to cautious optimism. Connor didn't stay long. CEOs didn't belong in the day-to-day operations of a single yard, but he visited often enough to keep the connection alive. On one of those visits, Connor found Tina leaning against her truck between runs, sipping coffee from a dented thermos. She smiled when she saw him, the kind of smile that comes from real relief. "My daughter asked why I've been home for dinner 3 nights this week," she said. "I told her someone finally fixed the mess." Matt joined them a moment later, wiping grease from his hands. "You didn't just fix the mess," he said, his voice low but steady. "You reminded us that someone up there actually cares." For a moment, the three of them stood in the cold afternoon light, no distance, just people who had weathered the same storm and came out standing. It was a quiet acknowledgement, but Connor knew it meant more than any formal award or handshake. On his last day in work boots, Connor walked the length of the yard with Matt and Tina, stopping to talk with drivers by name. He knew not everyone trusted him yet, but trust wasn't built with announcements, it was built by showing up. As he climbed into the company sedan that would take him back to the corporate office, Connor glanced once more at the rows of idling trucks. He'd come here to fix numbers in a spreadsheet. He was leaving knowing the real problems had always been about people, and that sometimes the only way to lead was to stand shoulder to shoulder with them in the grit and diesel smoke. This story reminds us that leadership isn't about titles. It's about standing where your people stand, even in the mud and diesel fumes. If you were in Connor's shoes, would you have given the guilty a second chance? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, hit like, share it with a friend, and subscribe to embrace the journey for more stories like this. See you in the next video.